The prestigious halls of the Whitfield Academy of Music resonated with their familiar symphony of sounds. Students rehearsing scales, instructors delivering sharp critiques, and the occasional outburst of artistic frustration. Moving through it all like a shadow, Margaret Hayes arranged sheet music and polished piano keys with quiet efficiency. At 42, Margaret deliberately faded into the background. Her auburn hair was swept into a simple ponytail, her gray cardigan unremarkable, her movements precise yet unassuming. 7 weeks into her role as administrative coordinator, most faculty barely acknowledged her existence, exactly as she intended. Miss Hayes, these scores need sorting by era, not alphabetically. Professor Victoria Sterling's authoritative voice sliced through the air like a maestro's baton, commanding and unforgiving. The department head barely lifted her eyes from her leather portfolio. "Certainly, Professor Sterling. I'll correct it immediately," Margaret responded quietly, accepting the stack of compositions from the professor's perfectly manicured fingers. Professor Sterling offered a brief nod before striding down the corridor, her stilettos creating a rhythmic percussion against the polished marble. Margaret observed her departure, a subtle smile touching her lips. As she reorganized the music, her gaze lingered on a particularly challenging Chopin transcription. Her fingers trembled almost imperceptibly, muscle memory stirring at the sight of the familiar notation. 7 years since her last public performance. 7 years since— "Daydreaming during work hours, Miss Hayes?" Professor Edmund Blackwood's voice interrupted her thoughts. The distinguished composition instructor peered at her through gold-rimmed spectacles, his silk tie characteristically askew. "Simply organizing, Professor," Margaret replied, quickly arranging the papers in proper sequence. Well, when you finish that task, Madame Rousseau requires assistance preparing for tomorrow's scholarship auditions. Something regarding program annotations. I'll attend to it right away." Professor Blackwood lingered, observing as she efficiently completed her organization. "You know," he mused, "for someone claiming no formal musical education, you handle those compositions as if you comprehend their intricacies." Margaret kept her focus downward. "I've absorbed some knowledge working here these 7 weeks. "Fascinating," he remarked, though his tone suggested doubt rather than praise. "Remember, Miss Hayes, understanding music demands more than familiarity with paper and notation. It requires years of discipline, natural ability, and proper cultivation." Margaret nodded humbly. "I wouldn't dare suggest otherwise, Professor." Satisfied, Blackwood wandered away, muttering about declining standards and times when staff understood their boundaries. Later that afternoon, Margaret knocked softly on the office door of Madame Catherine Rousseau, the Academy's esteemed French performance instructor. "Entrez," came the commanding response. Madame Rousseau sat behind her desk, reading glasses perched on her nose, surrounded by towering stacks of documents. At 68, she remained imposing, her platinum hair arranged in an elegant chignon, her posture impeccably straight. "Ah, Miss Hayes, finally. These program notes are catastrophic. I need them retyped and prepared for tomorrow's scholarship competition. The benefactors expect excellence." "Of course, Madame." Margaret accepted the pile, noticing the handwritten corrections in crimson ink scattered across the pages. "And please ensure accuracy this time. I cannot endure another embarrassment like last week's recital programs." Margaret suppressed her response. The embarrassment had been a single misplaced accent in a German composer's name, something Madame Rousseau had actually written incorrectly herself, though Margaret would never mention it. "I'll be thorough," she promised instead. As Margaret prepared to leave, Her attention caught the open score on Madame's piano, a Chopin transcription of Beethoven's Seventh Symphony, the very piece she'd been examining earlier. "Is this what Daniel Morrison will be performing tomorrow?" she asked before catching herself. Madame Rousseau raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Indeed. What concern is it of yours?" "It's—" Margaret hesitated, then continued carefully. "An ambitious selection for a student. Mr. Morrison is our most exceptional pupil. Ambitious is precisely what he requires." Madame Rousseau narrowed her eyes. "Though I hardly believe you're qualified to evaluate the difficulty of a Chopin transcription, Miss Hayes." "You're absolutely right. I apologize for overstepping." The morning of the scholarship competition arrived with anxious energy permeating the academy. Donors in tailored suits and pearls mingled with faculty in the grand entrance hall, while students sequestered themselves in practice rooms for final preparations. Margaret arrived early, wearing her finest charcoal dress, her hair braided more carefully than usual. Today's performances would determine which promising young musicians received the prestigious Whitfield Scholarship, a full scholarship that could transform careers. "Miss Hayes, thank goodness you're here," Professor Blackwood called, beckoning her to where he stood with a cluster of board members. "The programs, if you please." She handed him the neatly printed stack, still warm from the printing room. "Excellent." He barely glanced at them before distributing copies to the waiting donors. "Now, we need your assistance backstage. The students are experiencing their usual pre-performance anxiety." Backstage was indeed pandemonium. Young performers paced nervously, practiced silent finger exercises, or sat with closed eyes mentally rehearsing their pieces. Daniel Morrison, the Academy's star pupil, stood isolated from the others, his complexion ashen, hands trembling noticeably. "Mr. Morrison, are you feeling well?" Margaret approached him cautiously. The young man looked up, barely registering her presence. "Fine," he mumbled unconvincingly. "You're performing the Chopin, aren't you?" "I heard you practicing yesterday. It was magnificent." Daniel blinked, finally focusing on her. You were listening?" Margaret smiled gently. "It's difficult not to when something's played with such passion. But those technical passages," he began, then shook his head. "I don't know if I can manage it. Not today, not with everyone watching." A familiar ache pierced Margaret's chest, the memory of stage fright, of pressure so overwhelming it felt suffocating. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward his score. He handed it over, looking puzzled. Most administrative staff couldn't read music beyond elementary levels. Margaret flipped to the passage she'd heard him struggling with. "You're attacking this sequence too forcefully," she said softly. "Chopin's power, yes, but it's about finesse, not aggression. Try envisioning it as flowing water rather than crashing thunder." Daniel stared at her. "How do you know that?" Margaret returned the score quickly, realizing her error. "Just something I overheard Madame Rousseau tell another student once." Before he could question her further, Professor Sterling swept backstage, clipboard in hand. "Places, everyone. Mr. Morrison, you're opening our program." She turned to Margaret with a dismissive gesture. "Miss Hayes, please ensure the waiting area remains silent." As Margaret retreated, she heard Daniel whisper to himself, "Flowing water, not thunder. Water ... From the waiting area, Margaret listened as the scholarship competition commenced. Professor Sterling's voice echoed through the speaker system, welcoming the distinguished guests and explaining the significance of the day's events. The perfect acoustics of the recital hall carried every note clearly to where Margaret sat. Daniel performed first, his execution solid, though lacking inspiration. He applied Margaret's advice on the difficult passage, managing it more smoothly than in rehearsals. When he concluded, the applause was respectful, but not enthusiastic. One by one, the other students performed, some brilliantly, others succumbing to nerves. Margaret listened intently to each, her trained ear detecting subtleties most would overlook. During intermission, Madame Rousseau entered the waiting area, appearing flustered. "Miss Hayes, I need you to deliver these refreshments to the judges' table," she instructed, indicating a tray of water glasses. "And please be discreet." As Margaret carefully approached the judges' table, she overheard Professor Sterling speaking in hushed tones to Professor Blackwood. Morrison completely misunderstood the Chopin. Too restrained in the allegro, too hesitant in the fortissimos. I've told Catherine her methodology is becoming antiquated. These contemporary students need firm guidance, not French romanticism about feeling the music, Blackwood replied, sipping his coffee. Margaret placed the water glasses down silently, but Professor Blackwood noticed her presence. "Ah, our resident observer," he said loudly enough for Professor Sterling to look up sharply. "Tell me, Miss Hayes, what did you think of Mr. Morrison's performance?" The question was clearly intended to embarrass her, to establish her place, but something in Margaret, perhaps the music still resonating in her ears, perhaps the memory of her own mentors, compelled her to answer honestly. "I thought his technique was excellent, but he hasn't yet discovered the piece's soul. Chopin's transcriptions aren't merely technical exercises, they're reinterpretations that should capture both composers' spirits." The silence that followed was deafening. Professor Sterling's teacup froze midway to her lips. "I beg your pardon?" Professor Blackwood sputtered. Margaret blushed, lowering her gaze. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have spoken. It's not my position." "No, it certainly is not," Professor Sterling snapped. "Please return to your duties, Miss Hayes, and leave the artistic evaluations to those qualified to make them." As Margaret hurried back to the waiting area, she missed the bewildered look that passed between the professors, the first seed of suspicion taking root. The final portion of the scholarship competition was scheduled to begin after a brief intermission. The Academy's recital hall was filled to capacity. Wealthy donors, faculty, family members of performers, and fellow students all crowded into the elegant space. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over the audience, and the polished wood panels seemed to vibrate with anticipation. Backstage, however, a crisis was developing. "What do you mean he cannot perform?" Professor Sterling's voice, though whispered, carried an edge sharp enough to cut steel. "The Harrison Foundation representatives are here specifically to hear the Chopin." Daniel Morrison sat on a bench, head between his knees, breathing erratically. His right hand shook uncontrollably. "I can't feel my fingers," he gasped between breaths. "They're completely numb." Madame Rousseau knelt beside him, concern etched deeply in her features. "A panic attack, I believe. It happens even to the most gifted." "This is unacceptable," Professor Sterling hissed. "The Harrison donation depends on today's performances. They specifically requested a Chopin piece." Professor Blackwood paced the small backstage area, his tie now completely disheveled. "Can another student substitute with no preparation?" "Impossible. The Chopin transcription is extraordinarily difficult. None of our other students have prepared it." Margaret stood quietly in the corner, watching the scene unfold. The sheet music on the piano, Chopin's transcription of Beethoven's Seventh Symphony, seemed to beckon to her. 7 years since she'd touched a piano publicly. 7 years of healing, of uncertainty. "What about Richardson or Chen?" Blackwood suggested desperately. "Richardson already performed, and Chen is a cellist," Professor Sterling snapped. "We have no alternatives. We'll have to cancel the final performance." "Explain there's been a medical emergency," Madame Rousseau said grimly. Professor Sterling's face paled. "The Harrison Foundation will withdraw their offer. That's nearly $3 million in scholarship funding lost." As the professors argued in increasingly agitated whispers, Margaret found herself moving forward, drawn to Daniel's hunched form. She knelt beside him opposite Madame Rousseau. "Daniel," she said softly, "breathe deeply. Hold it for 4 counts, then release for 8. The young man tried to follow her instructions, his breathing gradually becoming less frantic. "The numbness is normal," she continued, her voice gentle but certain. "It will pass, but you need time." "There is no time," Professor Sterling interjected. "We begin in 5 minutes." "Actually," Margaret said, rising to her feet, her voice steadier than it had been in years, "I could perform instead." 3 pairs of astonished eyes turned toward her. Professor Blackwood recovered first, letting out a bark of laughter. "Don't be ridiculous, Miss Hayes. This isn't the time for humor." "I'm not being humorous," Margaret replied, meeting his gaze. "You're an administrative coordinator," Professor Sterling said slowly, as if explaining to a child. "This is one of the most technically demanding pieces in the piano repertoire. I'm aware of its complexity." Madame Rousseau studied Margaret's face, something shifting in her expression. "You said you had no musical training." "I never actually stated that," Margaret corrected gently. "You all assumed." The 3 professors exchanged glances, desperation warring with disbelief. "This is preposterous," Professor Sterling declared. "We cannot send an unqualified staff member to perform for the Harrison Foundation." From the recital hall they could hear the audience growing restless. The intermission had already extended too long. "What choice do we have?" Madame Rousseau asked, her French accent more pronounced in her distress. "We can either send Miss Hayes or admit we have no performer." Professor Blackwood shook his head vigorously. "This will be catastrophic." Professor Sterling closed her eyes briefly, calculations running behind her tightly drawn expression. When she opened them, her decision was made. "Fine," she said curtly. "Miss Hayes will perform. The piece is 16 minutes long. If nothing else, it buys us time to formulate an explanation to the donors." She turned to Margaret, her gaze cold. "Do you even know the piece?" "Yes," Margaret said simply. "This is completely irregular," Professor Blackwood continued to protest. "We know nothing about her abilities." "We know nothing about her at all, it seems," Madame Rousseau murmured, still studying Margaret with newfound curiosity. Professor Sterling stepped close to Margaret, lowering her voice to a threatening whisper. "If you embarrass this institution, your employment will be terminated immediately. Do I make myself clear?" Margaret nodded once, her heart beginning to race, not with fear, but with long dormant excitement. As they ushered her toward the stage, Professor Blackwood thrust the sheet music into her hands. "At least attempt to reference this while you play. Pretend you understand what you're doing." Margaret accepted the pages with a small smile. "I won't need these, but thank you." Before any of them could respond to this astounding statement, the stage manager gestured urgently. "We're on in 30 seconds." Professor Sterling took a deep breath, plastered on a professional smile, and walked onto the stage to address the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to an unexpected circumstance, Daniel Morrison will be unable to perform. However, we are fortunate to have another pianist who will present Chopin's transcription of Beethoven's 7th Symphony." As she spoke, Margaret closed her eyes, flexing her fingers gently. After 7 long years of recovery and doubt, Margaret Hayes, once known to the world as the brilliant Margaret Sinclair, was about to play again. The polite applause that greeted Margaret as she walked onto the stage was perfunctory at best. In the front row, Professor Sterling sat rigidly beside Professor Blackwood, both wearing fixed smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Madame Rousseau, however, leaned forward slightly, her gaze intense and curious. The magnificent grand piano gleamed under the stage lights, its lid propped fully open. Margaret approached it with reverence, adjusting the bench with practiced ease. This simple action, so familiar to any pianist but so precise in her execution, caused a subtle shift in the audience's attention. Seated at the instrument, Margaret took a moment to center herself. 7 years of physical therapy, of rebuilding strength in her damaged hands after the accident, had led to this moment. She hadn't planned it, hadn't known today would be the day she'd return to a piano bench before an audience. Yet, here she was. She placed her hands on the keys. From the first commanding chords of Beethoven's iconic symphony, transformed through Chopin's revolutionary piano adaptation, it was clear to everyone in the recital hall that something extraordinary was happening. Margaret's fingers moved with impossible precision, drawing sounds from the instrument that seemed beyond human capability. The famous opening theme resonated through the hall with all the power of an orchestra, yet with an intimacy only a solo piano could provide. In the audience, a transformation was taking place. Polite attention became stunned disbelief, which quickly turned to rapt amazement. Professor Sterling's fixed smile slipped away, replaced by wide-eyed shock. Professor Blackwood sat forward in his seat, glasses sliding down his nose unnoticed. As Margaret moved into the development section, her interpretation revealed not just technical mastery, but profound emotional understanding. This wasn't merely an accurate rendering of notes on a page. This was music brought to vibrant life, reimagined through the hands of someone who understood both Beethoven's revolutionary vision and Chopin's pianistic genius. Madame Rousseau was the first to visibly react. A soft "Mon Dieu" escaped her lips as recognition dawned on her face. She clutched Professor Blackwood's arm, whispering urgently, "C'est Margaret Sinclair." The name rippled through the audience in hushed whispers. Margaret Sinclair, the prodigy who had taken America by storm 18 years ago. Margaret Sinclair, whose career had been cut short by a terrible accident. Margaret Sinclair, who had disappeared from the public eye 7 years ago after a disastrous comeback attempt in Boston. On stage, Margaret was transported, reconnected to the part of herself she'd locked away for so long. Her hands, once damaged and weak, now moved with confident strength, drawing forth cascades of notes that filled the hall with glorious sound. The most challenging passages, the very ones Daniel had struggled with, flowed from her fingers as naturally as breathing. Where the young student had approached the piece with admirable technique but tentative emotion, Margaret played with the wisdom of someone who had known both triumph and devastating loss. Professor Sterling's face had lost all color. Professor Blackwood repeatedly removed and replaced his glasses, as if the action might change what he was seeing and hearing. Only Madame Rousseau seemed to have recovered from the initial shock, her eyes now glistening with unshed tears. As Margaret approached the final movements, she allowed herself to look up, to connect with the audience she had avoided seeing until now. The expressions that met her gaze weren't just impressed, they were transformed. The wealthy donors, the critical faculty, the competitive students, all were united in the singular experience of witnessing true artistry. With power and delicacy in perfect balance, Margaret brought the piece to its conclusion, the final chords resonating through the hall with commanding presence. Then silence. For 3 heartbeats, the entire room remained frozen, suspended in the aftermath of what they had just witnessed. Then the audience erupted. The standing ovation was immediate and thunderous. People who had been sitting in polite attention moments before were now on their feet, applauding with unrestrained enthusiasm. A few were wiping away tears, others calling, "Brava!" In the back row, a distinguished elderly patron was openly weeping. Margaret remained seated at the piano for a moment, hands resting lightly in her lap. Her eyes closed as she absorbed the sound washing over her, not of music this time, but of genuine appreciation. When she finally stood and turned to acknowledge the audience with a modest bow, the applause only intensified. Professor Sterling sat frozen in her seat, the color still drained from her face. Beside her, Professor Blackwood had finally given up trying to maintain his composure and was shaking his head in disbelief, mouth slightly agape. Only Madame Rousseau had joined the standing ovation, her eyes bright with emotion. As Margaret took a second bow, she noticed Daniel Morrison standing in the wings, his panic attack forgotten in the wonder of what he had just witnessed. She offered him a gentle smile before turning back to the audience. Professor Sterling finally found her ability to move and stood abruptly, making her way to the stage with mechanical steps. Taking the microphone, she addressed the still applauding audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, please," she said, her voice betraying a slight tremor. "It appears we owe you an explanation." She turned to Margaret, struggling to maintain her composure. "Would you care to introduce yourself properly, Miss Hayes? Or, should I say, Miss Sinclair?" A hush fell over the crowd as Margaret stepped forward. For years she had hidden her identity, buried her past. Now, standing in the warm stage lights, she felt a weight lifting. "Yes," she acknowledged simply. "I am Margaret Sinclair." The revelation sent another ripple of excitement through the audience. An older gentleman in an expensive suit leaned toward his companion, whispering loudly enough to be heard. Sinclair, the greatest interpreter of Chopin of her generation. Professor Sterling's smile had turned brittle. "Perhaps you could explain to our audience why one of the world's most celebrated pianists has been working as an administrative coordinator at our academy for the past 7 weeks. The question was meant to embarrass her, but Margaret faced it with newfound confidence. 7 years ago, I suffered an injury that doctors believed would end my career, she explained, her voice steady. After multiple surgeries and years of rehabilitation, I wasn't certain if I could or should return to performing. I needed to test myself, to rediscover my relationship with music away from the pressures of the concert stage. She glanced at the faculty members who were listening with varying degrees of chagrin. The Whitfield Academy's reputation for excellence drew me here. I wanted to immerse myself in music again, to observe and learn before deciding my next steps. Madame Rousseau joined them on stage, her elegant composure restored. "Why didn't you tell us who you were?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already understood. "Would you have treated me the same if you had known?" Margaret responded gently. The question hung in the air, unanswerable but pointed. Professor Sterling had the grace to look uncomfortable, while Professor Blackwood suddenly became very interested in straightening his tie. From the audience, a distinguished silver-haired man stood up. "Miss Sinclair, I'm Robert Harrison. My foundation came today hoping to fund promising new talent, but instead, we've witnessed a triumphant return. Would you consider conducting a master class for our scholarship recipients?" Before Margaret could respond, Professor Sterling stepped forward eagerly. The Whitfield Academy would be honored to host Ms. Sinclair for a series of master classes, she announced, her voice suddenly warm with enthusiasm. In fact, we've been in discussions about a potential artist-in-residence position. Margaret raised an eyebrow but said nothing about this blatant fabrication. Mr. Harrison smiled. Excellent. In that case, I believe we can increase our funding commitment. Talent deserves nurturing, wouldn't you agree, Professor Sterling? As the two began discussing details, Professor Blackwood approached Margaret, adjusting his glasses nervously. Miss Sinclair, he began, his earlier condescension replaced with awkward deference. I want to apologize for not recognizing your extraordinary talent. You never looked for it, Professor, Margaret replied without rancor. We often see only what we expect to see. He nodded uncomfortably, then added, I hope you'll consider staying on in a more suitable position, of course. As the professors crowded around her, suddenly eager to claim association with the famous Margaret Sinclair, Daniel Morrison approached hesitantly from the wings. Margaret noticed him and excused herself, stepping away from the fawning faculty. I've never heard anything like it, the young pianist said, awe evident in his voice. You will, Margaret assured him, with time and the right guidance. Will you teach me? He asked, hope brightening his features. I'd be honored, she replied sincerely, but only if you promise to play for yourself, not for them. She gestured toward the faculty and donors, now engaged in animated conversation. In that moment, looking at the young musician's earnest face, Margaret realized what her next chapter would be. Not a return to the isolating life of a touring virtuoso, but here, teaching, mentoring, sharing the wisdom her journey had given her. 2 months later, Margaret Sinclair sat in her new office at the Whitfield Academy of Music. The nameplate on the door read, Artist in Residence, a position created specifically for her after her triumphant return to the piano. Professor Sterling and Professor Blackwood had become almost painfully respectful, constantly seeking her approval for departmental decisions. Only Madame Rousseau treated her with natural warmth, neither overly reverent nor apologetic for the past. As Margaret reviewed applications for her master class, a knock came at her door. Daniel Morrison entered, carrying his sheet music for his upcoming recital. Professor Sinclair, he greeted her with a smile. I've been practicing that passage as you suggested. Let's hear it, she said, gesturing to the piano in the corner. As Daniel began to play, Margaret reflected on how quickly everything had changed. Sometimes the greatest revelations come not from hiding who we are, but from finally having the courage to reveal it.